colleagues have struggled with the what will you do less of and how would you respond to this. And I think it's a real problem in education. It's a different problem in education from what it is in most other aspects of the world of work. So I was doing this on Monday with a group of teachers. I asked them, which of these ideas you've heard would you like to experiment in your own practice? And they all chose something that they thought they could use. So I said then, are you working as hard as you can right now? And they said yes. I said, so your plates are full? And they said yes. And I said, so you foolishly agreed to take on something else even though you're working as hard as you can right now. So that's what we got to the, what are you going to do less of? So I asked them, what are you going to do less of or stop doing to give yourselves time to do the thing you said you wanted to do? They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it because they went through the list of all the things that they do and there wasn't a single thing there they felt they could stop doing. Why is this? It's because schools are almost hyper-optimized. So when you look for things to stop doing, you realize that almost everything that you're doing is actually good. See, in the business world, improving performance is quite easy because there's usually waste, and you just cut waste and the organizational performance improves. What those teachers on Monday were doing were looking for things that they were doing that didn't contribute to student learning. And there weren't any. Everything that they were doing was contributing to student learning. So here's why improving education is so different from everywhere else. In education, the only way to improve is to stop people doing good things to give them time to do even better things. Very few teachers do anything that actually harms student achievement. So if that's the case, the only way to give teachers time to work on getting better is to stop them doing good things. And what is interesting, of course, is they resist even that. Because I say to teachers, I think you're spending too much time marking. And they say, are you saying what I'm doing is no good? No, marking is good. But just think that a different use of that time could have resulted in even more student learning. And that's the challenge, I think. That's why we need leadership from heads and from governing bodies. We need people to be saying, it's okay not to do this. Not because it's bad, but because there's a better use of the time. And because people aren't willing to say that, there's a lot of dishonesty around, and fundamentally nothing gets changed. So we have to be upfront and say, this isn't going to get marked. Not everything is going to get marked. And when the parents say, why haven't you marked this book? Why haven't you marked everything my child has done? We say, because there are better things that we can do with our time. We could mark everything your child does. But that means that we'd have less time to prepare teaching, and that means that the education your child would receive would be less effective. So the really challenging thing for leaders in schools is to create this culture where people accept that it's not laziness, that not everything gets marked. It's a really difficult thing to get your head around. I once remember hearing as a kid, my parents and I were going on holiday somewhere, we were in a traffic jam, okay, bank holiday Monday or something, we're in a traffic jam. And my dad told me that motorways in England were only designed to cope with traffic on 350 days of the year. I said, that's outrageous. But he pointed out to me that, in fact, if your roads cope with the traffic on every single day of the year, you've spent too much money on roads. There's a trade-off there. You can't possibly, it's just stupid to spend money so that actually roads are never blocked. What you need to do is to think, where's the trade-off? What's the trade-off I want? In the same way, we can't do everything in schools. We can't mark all children's work and spend time planning. What we can do is to think carefully and explicitly about the trade-offs. So this extra hour, is it better to give it to marking or is it better to give it to collaborative planning? I don't know what the answer is. It may be different in different schools, but the important point is, I think that the reason that people find stopping doing stuff so hard is because they still haven't really grasped the idea that you've got to stop doing good stuff. And teachers will resist because they like doing the stuff that they're doing. So that's the big challenge there. How do you maximize the engagement of SLT in these sessions? Should they integrate into groups? In my view, no. I think that anybody who doesn't teach full-time has credibility as a practitioner for about 6 weeks after you stop teaching. For a while, when you're no longer teaching full-time, you can still remember how hard it is. But after about 6 weeks, you just forget. And basically, you have no credibility because you forget how hard. You think of all the things you might have done. Oh, yeah, it would be a good idea. But you didn't because it's just too bloody hard. So first of all, I think that if you're no longer teaching full-time, you don't understand how hard teaching full-time is. It's without a doubt the hardest job I've ever done. I worked far longer hours as a university leader, but I never worked as hard as I did when I was teaching. So leaders often feel alienated by this. One of the worries that that leaders have is, how will we know that teachers are doing the right thing in these groups? They want to check that teachers are still doing the right stuff. And I think there's an interesting model here from management. A guy called Douglas McGregor in 1960 wrote a book in which he proposed there were basically 2 different theories of management, which he called Theory X and Theory Y. Have you heard about the Theory X? I mean, he chose those 2 names so as to be absolutely neutral, that nobody would say this is a pejorative title or anything. Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X is that basically people are lazy and they need to be checked up on, and the job of managers is to make sure people are doing their jobs. Theory Y is that basically people are well motivated. They want to do a good job, and the job of leaders and managers is to resource people so they can actually get on and do their job. Now, Theory X isn't always wrong. There are some very lazy people in the world of work, and Theory Y isn't always right. But what is fascinating to me is the number of organizations that have discovered that Theory Y is a better place to start the conversation. There's a famous example from the Ford Motor Company. One of the big management ideas in the 1990s was alignment. So a lot of companies are in trouble because they're poorly internally aligned. So for example, you might have sales reps being incentivized on the basis of sales. So they actually give discounts to customers in order to get more sales. And so the sales rep gets a bonus because he's actually made more sales, but he's ruining the company because he's giving such discounts to his clients that actually every time you sell a product, you're losing money. So the big idea was alignment. And some corporate consultants came up with this idea of cascaded objectives. The idea was that the CEO would have his or her objectives set by the board, and then this person would cascade their objectives. So the CEO would cascade the finance objectives to the chief financial officer, the human resource objectives would be cascaded to the HR manager, and the idea that this would go all the way through the company. So each person had to make sure that their direct reports had objectives that were aligned with theirs. And what Ford discovered was rather interesting. They discovered that people could actually negotiate for themselves objectives that looked very challenging, but were in fact very easy to achieve. And so what happened was that every single person in the organization achieved their objectives, and yet they didn't get any better at making cars and trucks. The story of this is an article called Goals Gone Wild, in case you're interested. And what they discovered in Ford Motor Company, a car maker, was the thing that helped them improve performance most of all was just asking everybody in the company, just do your best. Just do your best. Now, I'm sure there are people who will be taking advantage of that. But what the Ford Motor Company discovered was that Theory Y was actually the most appropriate theory. People wanted to do a good job, and just saying, just do your best, enabled people to do even better. So, I know that leaders get a bit twitchy when they can't be in those meetings, but the point is that they will change the dynamic. The point is that any leader in a meeting of teachers talking about their teaching practice, any leader there will change the dynamic. People won't be as honest. And so therefore, my advice, it's your school, you're a head teacher, it's your school, you decide the rules, but my advice would be, don't attend those meetings. Stay out. Now, if you're getting really twitchy about what's going on in those meetings, my advice is for the head teacher or a member of SLT to become the leader of a PLC of TLC leaders. So the idea is, if you've got 4 or 5 TLCs in your school, the idea is that the leaders of those TLCs, and maybe 2 people from each TLC, meet together on a monthly basis with the SLT member or the principal and talk about what's going wrong, what's going well. So the idea is that we create this PLC that helps the TLC leaders do their job more effectively. And you can use exactly the same agenda that's in the EFA pack. So basically you have an introduction, you have a warm-up. Activity 3 is always what's going on in your meetings. Are there any people who are being awkward? Let's problem solve around that. Activity 4 is always looking forward. What's the next 2 meetings going to be about? Activity 5 is personal action planning. Activity 6 is the wrap. So the same structure can be used for those meetings of TLC leaders. That's the way I would suggest you would evolve SLT. Because what we've discovered is it's very easy to find out what's going on at those meetings just from those leaders, just from those meetings. Heads, principals could find out very easily. So that would be my advice. Just basically keep the TLC being teachers and then maybe have other structures to look at those things. Okay, any questions on that so far, on these 2 questions? Any idea, any thoughts or requests for clarification? Yeah?
There was an idea somebody raised, and I can't remember where it was, where they said that they embedded their leadership team members as part of the group as learners as well, rather than as monitors in any way. What do you think of that?
I mean, I've seen it work successfully, I've seen it work badly. So I've seen it work successfully where the deputy head, for example, behaves like a main scale teacher. And always, and in fact, it was very positive because this deputy head talked about all the mistakes she made. And she was respected as a very good practitioner as well as a deputy head. So that was very liberating for the group to see that this person was admitting to making the mistakes. So I think it can be very, very powerful. That said, some people find it very difficult not to share the fruits of their experience with others. So they find it very difficult just to be there as an ordinary teacher rather than a deputy head or a head. But yeah, as long as they are, just one of the group, and that's, and of course that is the whole ethos of the model, is that there are no experts in this group. There are like-minded people getting together. By the way, if you want a stat to get rid of this idea that there are experts or experienced teachers who know it all and novices who know nothing, it turns out that a good teacher, one of the people who just get it naturally, they're really good straight away, a good teacher is better on their first day, more effective in terms of student progress, than an average teacher will be after 20 years in the classroom. So an outstanding novice is better on their first day than an average teacher will be after 20 years. The range of teacher quality is almost as great after 20 years as it is after, on day one. That, to me, is the current answer to, are teachers born or made? Right now they're born because we're not very good at making them. So my aim is to reduce the variation in teacher quality, because there'll be a huge variation in teacher quality on day one, because some people get it naturally. The work of Helen Atterbury and her colleagues shows that actually, you probably all know this, that teachers improve very rapidly in their first year. In terms of how much their kids learn, teachers improve rapidly in their first year, slightly more slowly in the second year, and even more slowly in their third year. What most people don't realize is that almost all the improvement in the average teacher over the first 3 years of their career is made by below average teachers. If you take teachers in terms of their performance in their first year, how much their kids learn, and divide it into what are called quintiles, top 20%, next 20%, middle 20%, next 20%, bottom 20%. The top 2 quintiles don't seem to improve at all in their first 5 years. They're naturals, so they get, but they don't get any better because there's no incentive for them to get better. Teaching is easy to those guys. The teachers who find teaching much more difficult seem to improve much more rapidly. So this is consistent with the research on expertise. People with higher IQs are better chess players for a year or two. But after a while, it's the amount of chess you've studied, the number of games you've played, it's the practice that overtakes the talent. And I think the same thing is true for teaching. It's ridiculous to pretend that some people aren't naturally better than others as teachers. It's obvious. But the important point is, those who want to get better can get better. And as I said, my aim is to reduce the variation in teacher quality as teachers get older, and it doesn't seem to happen at the moment. Okay, any other questions or thoughts on this? Okay, more questions on the next slide. What do you think has been the key to assessment for learning or formative assessment withstanding and enduring significant changes in education, including several curriculum reforms, whereas other initiatives have been rebranded, improved, or left behind? Well, the sense there is the questioner is maybe surprised that that's happened. I'm not, and I don't think Paul Black is either, for several reasons. First, we came to formative assessment when we were looking for something that could be used in any classroom. So my search, my quest for the last 20 years has been in search of effective, scalable teacher professional development. So many years ago, I convinced myself that replacement of teachers by better ones was never going to be an option for most countries. I was convinced by the teacher quality research. Teacher quality is the crucial variable, so you can improve teacher quality either by sacking existing teachers and replacing them with better ones, or by investing in the teachers you've got. And I was pretty clear from the research that sacking teachers and replacing them just doesn't work. There aren't any better ones out there. So you have to invest in the teachers you've got. So the question is, how do you do that? Because the story, the story of professional development is not a particularly successful one. Our track record in improving teacher performance through professional development has been pretty poor. So we looked for things that were effective and scalable. And that means you can't pin it to a particular curriculum, because those things come and go. So Paul Black and I have always been very clear that for us, formative assessment is not tied to any particular curriculum. This is proving to be a big problem right now, because we've been trying to scale up some projects in Africa, and there are some people who really want formative assessment to be about dialogic teaching. Now, I happen to like dialogic teaching. I think it's got a lot. I'm not sure I could do it with a class of 70 to 90 kids in Africa. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sure it's the solution for every single country right now. But the point is, to me, formative assessment is independent of any curriculum, and independent of any view about what happens when learning takes place. So there are several models of learning. The two most common are the associationist view, basically that kids learn by making links between stimulus and response, and the constructivist view. Kids make sense of the world around them that they experience. And there's a big debate about whether the constructivists are right or the associationists are right. And the answer is probably they're both right. I mean, learning number facts, drill and practice is probably quite an effective approach, but there's no doubt that in mathematics and science, for example, kids make sense of stuff in ways that are completely unpredictable. Kids bring their own ideas to the situation. Oh, and by the way, those ideas never go away. Recent research on physics experts suggests that the difference between experts and novices is not a conceptual change. It's the experts know that the intuitive way of thinking about it is wrong. It's what Daniel Kahneman, the only psychologist to win a Nobel Prize, calls thinking fast and slow. So when I grab a cold door handle in the winter, even with my degree in physics, I think that the cold is coming into my hand. But then my physicist kicks in and says, actually, it's the heat that's being drawn from your hand because metal conducts better than wood. So the point is, we all have those intuitive reactions. What actually happens when you get better is you learn not to choose those things. So the point is, in science, that kind of constructivist model works better. But here's the point. Both people need formative assessment. You see, if you just believe that learning is making links between stimulus and response, you need formative assessment to find out whether enough reinforcement has been done for that learning to have been solidified. If you believe that learning is making connections and constructing your own knowledge, you need formative assessment to find out whether those constructions have been made appropriately. So the important point is, it doesn't matter what you think learning is, formative assessment is needed. It'll play out differently in those two things, but every teacher needs formative assessment. Why? Because children do not learn what we teach. Simple as that. You know, if children learned what we taught, we'd never need to assess. We could just write down what we taught, secure in the knowledge that this was something that they'd learned. But children do not learn what we teach. And put that with another principle from David Ausubel's work 50 years ago. David Ausubel 50 years ago said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important determinant of effective learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. Start from where the learner is. It's obvious, isn't it? Except we don't do it. We say really stupid things to our children like, you should know this, you're in year 5. What a stupid thing to say. In England, how do you get into year 5? Start in year 4 and have a birthday, basically. So there isn't a test to get into year 5, so it's ridiculous to say you should know this, you're in year 5. So, good teaching starts where the student is. Students do not learn what we teach. That's why formative assessment is at the heart of effective teaching. It's about finding out where students are before we do anything else. And it's needed because it's unpredictable. The other reason I'm not surprised is when you think about it in that way, you begin to realize that formative assessment is about relating two things. What did I do as a teacher? What did my students learn? And as long as teachers are reflecting on those two ideas and trying to figure out the relationship between them, then teachers are always going to be able to advance their practice. So if you think of it that way, formative assessment addresses the fundamental thing about teaching, which is the relationship between teaching and learning. That said, I'm not sure I agree with the assumption in the question. I mean, I don't think we've got very far in AFL. I mean, first of all, you need to... Paul Black and I've always talked about formative assessment. I mean, we've used the phrase AFL occasionally to show why it isn't formative assessment. But I don't know if you're interested in this. So Paul Black and I were asked by the Assessment Reform Group to review the research on formative assessment, which we did in this publication that it was a 70-page academic journal article. Somebody described it as a both elbows on the table read, you know. It's not light reading. And we thought, actually, this deserved a wider readership. So that's why we came up with the idea of inside the black box. What was interesting was the Assessment Reform Group weren't interested in that. They didn't want a booklet. They just wanted some evidence so they could use in their writing. And they were a policy group. Paul Black and I were far more interested in the practice in classrooms. So we wrote Inside the Black Box, and then, I don't know if you remember, at the time, the government was kind of working through the numeracy strategies and the literacy strategies, and there's also then, well, what happens when you get into Key Stage 3? So then there was the Key Stage 3 strategy. So at one point, there was something on learning how to learn, or learning skills, and the idea was, some civil servant had the idea of wrapping these all together in a grand Key Stage 3 strategy. So Paul Black and I were summoned to the DFE and asked to, say what we've been doing. And we talked about the research on feedback and show how grades and levels get in the way of learning. And I kid you not, a civil servant said, we can't do that. It wouldn't look good in the Daily Express. So basically they were just worried about what the newspapers would say. So what was interesting, although they tried to roll in the work that we'd done on formative assessment into the Key Stage 3 strategy, they couldn't put into the strategy any of the things that we said needed to be done to actually bring the research into classrooms, because it was just politically unacceptable. So they started calling it assessment for learning. And the real problem is, assessment for learning meant different things in different phases. So when David Miliband was schools minister in 2003, he was very clear that assessment for learning was tracking kids' progress. I sometimes joke that this is the oracle of the spreadsheet. That basically from that moment on, every secondary school had a spreadsheet that was worshipped for it has magical powers. There's always a high priest of the spreadsheet, usually a deputy head, and this person's sacred task was to feed the spreadsheet with data so that it spat out predictions of the GCSE grades of the various students in year 11. Didn't tell you what you do about it, but at least your pending failure came with plenty of advance warning, and if things were really bad, you could begin to polish up the CV. The problem was, that's what DFE thought assessment for learning was. And they could always wrap it up by saying, it's all about knowing where students are in their learning and making adjustments appropriately. But the point is, that was such a mechanistic, bureaucratic procedure that it was just monitoring. In key stages 1 and 2, it was often about giving children national curriculum levels or then sub-levels on individual pieces of work. And the other thing, of course, is that then there was this thing called making good progress. And it's important to understand the reason for making good progress. And the way that it shaped it the way it did. If you remember, my old employer, Educational Testing Service, won the contract for testing Key Stage 3 in 2007. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember the fiasco? That they basically couldn't do it? They had no idea. I mean, in America, all the people who do the marking come to a central location and the scripts don't leave. They just couldn't cope with the idea of 20 million pieces of paper in the post in May, going from GCSE boards and exam boards to the markers and back. They just couldn't cope with it. So then a decision was taken to cancel the contract, so they had no tests. And so they were trying to salvage a quick win from this. And one of the senior advisors, Richard Brooks at the DFE, I think came up with this idea of, well, let's use teacher assessment instead. Let's actually get a win from a loss, if you like. And so that was the idea of making good progress. It was somehow stand in for the missing Key Stage 3 tests. But then they tried to portray it as being a formative device, but in fact it was always intended to bolster teacher summative assessment at the end of Key Stage 3. So every time assessment for learning got on the agenda, if you like, it was always kind of subverted, and so we've never done it. Just another example. When my wife and I came back from America in 2006, I had a job starting in September 2006. My wife's job didn't start till January 2007 as a head in Edmonton. So she filled in as an advisor for a London borough. She was the Key Stage 3 strategy manager for a London borough. And she went around various of the secondary schools in this London borough and asked the heads, how are we doing with assessment for learning or formative assessment? And they said, it's embedded, they said. It's embedded. She said, great, could I see some examples? And the head said, sure. So she actually went to, I think, 30 different classrooms, all of which had been selected by the heads as being particularly good examples of assessment for learning. She didn't see a single example of good AFL practice. Not one. Some very charismatic teaching, some very engaging teachers, not one example of good AFL practice. So the point is, we've never really figured out how to tell people this is formative assessment of AFL and this is not. And so that's why I think that I'm not sure I accept the premise, because I'm not sure we're there yet. And I think that the understanding is still pretty weak outside this room, to be quite honest. I mean, it's depressing how many teachers still do what I did when I first started teaching, which is to find out if the class is ready to move on. You ask a question, 3 kids raise a hand, you pick on one of them, they give you the correct answer, they give you they give a correct answer, the whole class moves on. And incidentally, that's why I think it's right to think of this as an assessment process. I can't remember if I said this at the launch meeting 2 years ago. But the crucial thing for me, an assessment is simply a procedure for drawing inferences. That's all an assessment is. We give students things to do, we look at what they do, and we draw conclusions. And the point is, thinking about teachers' regular classroom practice as an assessment procedure draws attention to the adequacy of the evidence that you have for those conclusions. And as soon as you start bringing that lens to practice, as soon as you start thinking, how do I know what's going on in the heads of the children that I'm not hearing from, then I think teachers begin to think a bit more flexibly about what they might be doing. But for me, it's always about the practice, if you like. And as I said, I still see kids raising their hands. I still see teachers making decisions about the learning needs of the whole group based on confident, articulate high achievers. I still see comments and grades together rather than separately. So I still see really bad collaborative learning. I mean, Bob Slavin's work shows really clearly that to get good cooperative learning, you need two conditions: group goals, individual accountability. It happens naturally in the orchestra. We're all working together on the same piece of music, and one student playing a bad note screws it up for everybody. It happens in sport. One person missing a catch in a cricket game harms the whole team's chances of winning. But what is interesting is, most teachers in English and maths and science classrooms, they set up group work in a way that allows one student to do the work for the whole group. Teachers assign roles to kids in groups. And that's not bad, unless you assign the reporter. And a number of times I see teachers giving kids roles, and the reporter is assigned at the beginning of the task. If you're not the reporter, you know you can DOS, because it's not going to be you. But what is interesting is, all you need to do is to switch it so that actually reporter is going to be appointed at the end. So for this group, we don't know who's going to be the reporter, and you're not paying attention, I'm going to be on your case, because we're all going to look bad if it gets you, if you're the one who gets chosen to report back and you haven't been paying attention. So what is interesting is, we know what we need to be doing, it's just really hard to get people doing it. What are the plans for the future of the EFA project? I mean, there's a project. There's funding for 2 years, presumably. Is that right?
Yeah.
Don't know. If you think it's been worthwhile, I mean, I always suggest that people start in schools. The National College years ago tried to get these things called network learning communities, and they were these things where people would go to other schools, and yet teachers love visiting other schools. It's great fun, but nothing changes. And so that's why I've always been very keen on schools focusing internally on problems of practice. But now that you've got this strong track record of actually working with these ideas, and I can see that's true from the displays, I think it might be worthwhile thinking about how can you begin to start developing a language of description? How can you begin to synthesize what you've all done in your separate schools and start talking about it in a way that might be possible to communicate that to others? I'll talk a bit more about that in my keynote address. But I think the really powerful thing that you could do is to become a group of schools that takes thinking forward in this way and finds ways of talking about it that is accessible to people who aren't yet doing it. And you'll probably be better at that than me because you're much closer to the practicalities. So my hope is that you'll be able to either get some funding or just fund it yourselves. But the idea is that you would actually become some kind of body of people who write about this sort of stuff and generate examples of practice. Videos, I think, would be very powerful. And you could actually begin to start doing something very, very exciting in terms of dissemination. But from a basis of expertise rather than just being, here's an idea I came up with on the way in the car on the way to school this morning. How will it be adapted to provide a more differentiated approach to schools at different stages in embedding formative assessment? Where do we go with staff who are ready to take AFL to the next level, as AFL is fully embedded in their practice and has been shared with others? I'm not sure that AFL is ever fully embedded in people's practice. So, I mean, for me, as I outlined earlier, for me now, formative assessment, or AFL, is the key focus for any professional development, because it's relating what I did to what my students learned. And so it seems to me that there are two big ideas here. One is a pedagogy of engagement, and one is a pedagogy of responsiveness. There's a third thing, drawing on the work of Lee Shulman, which he calls a pedagogy of formation. There's an issue that we haven't really tackled yet, which is the subject specificity of good formative assessment. So right now in this group, we are talking about formative assessment as being a generic approach. And I think it's really important that we do that, because it enables children students in school to have a relatively coherent experience. The idea that they see similarities in how maths teachers teach and how science teachers teach. You know, the tragedy of secondary school is children expect a different set of rules in every single classroom. And so I think thinking about formative assessment as a generic set of tools is helpful in creating that consistency across the school. But I think we also need to recognize the subject specificity of formative assessment. What makes good feedback in history is very different from what makes good feedback in maths. And so I think we need to start thinking about how we can actually begin to develop that subject specificity. But as long as we are recognizing that, I think the whole idea of focusing on your practice, how can I increase the engagement and how can I increase the responsiveness? And I don't think anybody's written the final word on that. I mean, you know, in the presentations that I do with teachers, I am constantly modifying them to adjust my practice in ways that I hope engage them better. I mean, let's see if I can find a quick example here. Okay, here's a good example. Okay, so this is from Pisa. Which of these is most strongly associated with high student achievement? So looking at the Pisa results, 2015, where they focus on science, which of these factors is most strongly associated with high student achievement? Right, so this would be the non-formative assessment way to do it, letting somebody volunteer. Okay? And that, you know, we do this in presentations all the time. We get volunteers saying something. But how would you do it if you wanted to do it with a formative assessment? You say, okay, spend a minute, talk to a neighbour. Go on, now, just talk to a neighbour. Discuss. Okay, thank you. So, you know what I'm going to do next, don't you? I'm going to ask you to vote. 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D, 5 for E. But I'll give you my usual warning. Don't forget, I can tell if you haven't voted. So in my classroom, it is far safer to be confidently incorrect than it is to fail to vote. Okay, so you wanted to vote for 2?
I do.
You can't, because you have 2 hands?
Yes.
So you are able to vote for 2, but I'm telling you that one of these is more strongly associated with student achievement than all the others. So you can vote for 2, but there's only one correct answer because this is from that table in the OECD report. Okay, so 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D, 5 for E. Please vote now. Interesting. Thank you, hands down. I don't think anybody got it right. So the point is, I didn't know what I was going to say to the group until I saw how you voted. If you'd all voted correctly, I'd have said something completely different. So this is a pedagogy of responsiveness. What I say depends on the evidence that I collect on the basis of this question. And it's also a pedagogy of engagement because I'm not going to decide that on the basis of 1 or 2 people's confident assertions. You're certainly with the majority by choosing E, but it's wrong. The answer is C. Sorry, D. So I had to do that because, see, there's always somebody who says yes. Yeah. And because nobody voted for D, I couldn't get that, so I had to get that yes in there. So here's the point. I'm constantly looking for ways when I'm working with teachers, policymakers, education ministers, to get them engaged, to get them to understand what it's like to be in a classroom where a teacher uses these techniques. In particular, this pedagogy of engagement and this pedagogy of responsiveness. And this took me about an hour to come up with. I was doing a talk to a group of teachers that I'd worked with before, and I'd used up all the good examples previously. And so I had to come up with a new example where most people would be surprised that they were wrong. Okay? And it turns out, if you look at the OECD data set for Pisa, for science, in 2015, the number one, the most strongly positively associated thing with student achievement is student socioeconomic status. The second one is teacher adaptive instruction, formative assessment. The lowest one is low student socioeconomic status. The second lowest is student absenteeism, missing at least one day in the last 2 weeks. The third lowest thing for student achievement is the amount of inquiry-based teaching, student-led inquiry. It's consistently associated with low student achievement. Not because it necessarily is bad, but because teachers don't do it very well. In science in particular, teachers do lots of stuff where kids are messing about in laboratories, but they don't have the conceptual knowledge to make sense of what they're seeing. So there's an awful lot of time wasted. But the point I want to make here is that there is no limit to how we can use these ideas in our teaching to constantly renew and constantly find new ways of doing things, creating more engagement in the audience or the group or the students, and creating more responsiveness. So you're finding out what people need to learn before you actually give them anything to learn. So I just thought that'd be quite useful and interesting for you to see that. So for me, I don't think anybody's got AFL embedded completely. What differentiation advice? I'm just not sure. If I had to give an answer to the question, I think what I would do is to try to encourage them to think about what I call inclusive differentiation. So what worries me about differentiation is the amount of work that teachers have to prepare. You have to effectively prepare 3 different lessons for the same group, and that's crazy. Let me give you an example of inclusive differentiation. So in a typical English Key Stage 3 classroom, when a teacher is doing a topic like area of a trapezium, in most classrooms it looks like this. Teacher introduces students to the rule. If they're lucky, they'll get an explanation about why the rule works. Take a trapezium, slice it horizontally between the parallels, flip that over. The height is now half h. It's a parallelogram. What's the base? A plus b. That's why the formula is half h, a plus b. And then the teacher might do one worked example, and then the children have to do in their seats 20 or so practice. In Japan, a teacher will introduce one method of finding the area of trapezium, and then the students in groups have to come up with as many conceptually distinct ways of finding the area of a trapezium. So one way is to slice horizontally between the parallels, flip that bit over. Another way to do it is to take the triangle bits and lop them off and flip them up and show that results in the same formula. Does anybody know how many conceptually distinct ways there are of finding the area of a trapezium? Does anybody know it for a fact? Interesting. See, every Japanese middle school teacher knows this. It's part of their subject knowledge. It's what they get taught in college. They're expected to know there are exactly 13 ways of finding the area of a trapezium. But some are more difficult than others. One of them involves taking the trapezium, completing the triangle, and then using the properties of similar triangles to subtract the area of the smaller triangle off the area of the larger triangle to leave the trapezium. And what the teacher will do is when the kids are working on this, if there's a group that's actually making good progress, the teacher will say, one of these methods involves areas of similar triangles. See if you can figure it out. So the important point is, the differentiation comes by the probing and the pushing that the teacher does to encourage some students to respond at a higher level. But the whole class is still engaged in the same task. Now, we used to call that sort of thing differentiation by outcome. And I think that's a terrible term because it's really sloppy. Because actually, it wasn't teacher mediated at all. It was just some kids doing good work and some kids doing not so good work. So what I mean by inclusive differentiation is much more aggressive than that in life, if you like. It is the teacher setting up a task where, depending on how the students do with it, the teacher can ramp up the cognitive demand of that task for some students and not others. So I mean, I think that's where we ought to be heading in terms of our energies. I don't know how feasible it's going to be, but it seems to me that's a far more powerful model. The other thing that's quite interesting is if you look at maths teaching and to a lesser extent science teaching all over the world, there is now emerging this kind of consensus about good teaching, which involves a big question, student discussion, teacher-led, discussion of the whole class's ideas, and then students maybe consolidating. So maybe something like that might be possible as well. But I think we also have to accept that because we socially promote students in this country, the range of achievement is very large unless we set. And so you can't really have a good discussion about differentiation without acknowledging, first of all, that we set, for, at least for mathematics, and often for a number of other subjects. And the fact that by its very nature, setting doesn't reduce the range of achievement very much because it's impossible to get the right kids in the right set. The limitations of assessment technology mean that typically we get about 50% of the kids in the right set. So I think this is going to be important even if we set for subjects because the range of achievement in a set is much greater. So the joke is, I have to walk into a school and say, what's your policy on differentiation? We set. As if the problem is now solved, and of course it isn't. What is the most effective way to continue to embed and develop formative assessment in year 3 onwards? Well, so let's talk about year 3. Because you've seen years 1 and 2 of the program, everybody says, when's year 3 coming out? And the whole point is, year 3 is never coming out. Because if you have done years 1 and 2 properly, you'll be ready to write year 3 yourself. And if you're not ready to write year 3 yourself, you need to go back and do years 1 and 2 again properly. The point is that year 3 should be you taking over, deciding what goes into activity 4. That's all it is. It's just activity 4. Because activities 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 are going to be the same no matter what you do. So what's activity 4 going to be? Well, you could actually do a book study. You could actually have subject-specific focuses. So some schools have things like formative assessment and information technology, formative assessment in the 6th form, formative assessment and special needs. So you could actually have these kind of specialized working groups, but basically teachers who've been in this program should be able to come up with 8 20-minute activity 4 sessions for a year pretty easily. And so basically that's why I think the answer is in your own hands. And those are just ones I can remember off the top of my head. You could have loads of other focuses. You could have language across the curriculum. I just don't care. But the important point is it still needs to be formative assessment because that's what gives you the warrant that it's going to be effective. As soon as you step away from formative assessment, you have no guarantee this is going to be effective in raising student achievement. Lots of things look great, but aren't. We're looking to develop a lesson study format to replace observations. Okay, now I have no idea what that means because lesson study is actually, lesson study is the English translation of a Japanese phrase that's used to describe a process that's conducted in Japanese schools to improve education. Now this process typically involves a group of 3 or 4 teachers getting together and deciding to work on a lesson like the area of a trapezium. And they may be meeting for an hour a week for 6 weeks to discuss all the approaches that have been tried, all the textbooks that are available about this, all the research on this topic, and then they'll eventually come up with a lesson for teaching this one, this one topic. So one lesson. One of the three teachers will then give the lesson with the other two in the classroom with their clipboards. They'll then revise the lesson, and then sometime later, they will give it again to a different group of students, but this time the whole maths department will be there with their clipboards, taking notes, and they'll discuss it. If it survives that process, they will then do what they call a research lesson. They'll take a gymnasium and they'll create a little classroom in the middle, and you'll have a class of 40 Japanese kids, the teacher, the overhead projector, and 300 maths teachers from all over the prefecture with their clipboards, watching this lesson, and then you will you will have a half-day conference on this lesson and how the lesson could be improved. And the focus is never on the teacher, it's always on the lesson. So which of these two concepts should we introduce first? This one or this one? We don't just talk about that. In Japan, if they were teaching English, they'd have a lesson on figurative language. In which sequence should you introduce alliteration, hyperbole, personification, onomatopoeia, and simile? That's part of their craft knowledge. That's lesson study. So when this process was brought to England, nobody really fancied spending 6 months on one lesson. So when the National College got hold of lesson study, it became one lesson a week with a few teachers trying it out. And because they realized they were open to criticism, they then started calling it learning study rather than lesson study, so they could not be accused of subverting the term. So, basically, I don't know what people mean by lesson study in England anymore. But if you really want to make something powerful, I would actually say drive peer assessment underground. So the idea is that if you and I are working on formative assessment, I invite you into my classroom because I would like some feedback on something that I'm doing. So you come into my classroom and I say, I'm trying to improve my wait time. I give you a stopwatch, you measure my wait times, and all the records you make belong to me. So I think we need to have two processes going on in every school. Performance management, driven by SLT, regularly appraising teachers. Below the radar, genuine peer assessment with peers getting together. And the only record that exists of this thing is that you certify that you did observe and give me feedback on my lesson. And the SLT are not even allowed to know what it was that was in that feedback. Because the important point is the process happens. Any more bureaucratic than that, and it'll get distorted. So for me, I would actually have that process completely separate. So you have performance management at a summative level, and you have this genuinely formative process operating below the radar. And as I said, if you want to be sure it's happening, then insist on proof that it's actually happening, but don't actually make it any more bureaucratic than that. Does anybody have any insight into what that question? What is a lesson study format that might replace observations? Anybody know? Right.
They'll work as a team, and you will go in and support. So say if us three were working together, and I said, right, I want to work on this aspect of what I'm doing. This is what I'm planning to do.
Right.
I would like you two to come in and have a look and give me some
Okay.
feedback on it, and then we work it between the three of us.
Fine. Okay.
That's just what I've heard.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just going to add to that. We're using the sort of TDT approach to lesson study, which is where you would work, like the lady said, in a triad, and you would diagnose a problem either with a shared class that you all
Right.
have in common ideally, but if not, with different classes.
Okay.
And then each help each other with that, followed by some research that might help them.
Right. So the problem with that kind of problem centering, you might call it, is that there's no mechanism inherent to that process that's going to make sure that teachers talk about important stuff. So when teachers raise problems, the solutions to those problems might actually solve the problems, but there's no guarantee that those problems were problems that were worth solving in the first place. They could be things like, things that have a trivial impact on student learning. And what I'm trying to do is to steer the whole conversation onto, let's start by improving the things that have the biggest payoff for children, which is why I'm so against things like network learning communities or critical triads, because there's no guarantee that they're going to improve stuff. And that's my criticism of work of people like Michael Fullan. I like Michael personally, I love his work, but it's all about process. And the point is you can apply those processes to things that matter, and you can also apply those processes to things that don't matter. The classic example of this is the Danielson Framework for Teaching, which is the best researched teacher observation framework in the world. There are 4 domains of practice. 2 of them have no impact on student achievement. It doesn't matter how good your teacher is at this particular set of things, you're going to learn the same amount. There's 2 domains which have a huge impact, but there's 2 domains you're taught by a highly rated teacher, you won't benefit as a student. And the problem is, teachers can get better at stuff that doesn't help students learn more. And that's why this EFA project is so different. Because we started with how can we get teachers doing formative assessment and then figured out how to support them, rather than saying, how can we get teachers working together, and then let's think of something they can do together. So I call that the kind of process-rich model, I call it blind. Because it could produce useful stuff, it might not. Lesson study is the same. There's no guarantee that lesson study is ever going to do anything useful. It might do, it might not. Our kids don't have the time to wait. So that's why I think we have to focus on what the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit shows has the biggest impact. You know, what are the 3 most cost-effective things in the toolkit? Feedback, self-regulated learning, peer tutoring. 3 of the 5 strategies of formative assessment. What about the other 2? Well, you can't give feedback until you've got the evidence about what's going wrong, so you have to elicit evidence, and you don't know which evidence to elicit until you've got the learning intentions clear. So the point is that structure is the most compact way of doing what the toolkit says has the biggest impact on student achievement. As soon as you step away from that, then you're gambling. I mean, you know, some things, social and emotional aspects of learning, probably going to be a good thing. Probably in 10 years' time we'll have really good research. Mindset, not so sure. Grit, not so sure. Educational neuroscience, almost certainly not. The point is, there's a whole list of things we might do. The task of leaders is to keep the organization focused on the things that have the biggest payoff for kids. Okay, so let's go on to the questions on assessment. If I had a time machine and could change anything in my early writing on formative assessment, what would I change? I think I would go back and stop talking about comment-only marking. The big mistake that Paul Black and I made, in my opinion, I haven't talked to Paul about this, but by focusing on feedback, we focused on the least powerful part of the system. See, feedback is labor-intensive. It's one-to-one teaching. And now I would start talking about the things I've been talking about today, which is engagement and responsiveness. It is teachers using evidence to improve their teaching minute by minute and day by day. Feedback doesn't happen often enough to have a big impact on student achievement. I've already dealt with this question really about AFL has not had the impact on national outcomes that many expected. Why is this? We didn't do it. It's very simple. We just didn't do it. What do I think are the greatest challenges of the new 1-to-9 system? I don't think there are any problems inherent in the 1-to-9 system because it's just a scaling issue. I think there are real issues in how schools are handling that. But the most pernicious aspect of this, I suppose, is that it is what an economist would call a positional good. The idea is we have to restrict the supply of high scores. Which we don't do things for the driving test. You know, basically, with certain tests, if you meet the standard, you pass, no matter how many other people have passed. This is being driven by, well, actually, nobody in the university world wants this. This is governments trying to produce something that nobody actually particularly wants. But they're trying to talk up high standards by saying, we're going to have this. And Singapore does this as well. I mean, Singapore does this, like only 3% can get the top so many grades. And so it's just not a very smart assessment system. But the other point, of course, is that formative assessment was always designed to be completely independent of any assessment system. Because it's all about, I don't care what you're trying to achieve. Let's say you're trying to maximize your kids' scores on GCSE or A-level. Then formative assessment will still help you do it better. So the whole point is, whatever you're trying to do, even if you're trying to teach creationism more effectively, formative assessment will help you do that. So, What's really important with formative assessment is that you are clear about what you want your students to learn. That's why sharing learning intentions is always the first strategy. But as soon as you are clear about what it is you want your students to learn, then formative assessment can kick in. But formative assessment will never tell you what to do. How can we make students believe that they can still achieve the grade possible when the goalposts change? I mean, in my view, the really important thing is to finesse the work of Carol Dweck. So, is it another test? So Carol Dweck, the big idea she had was that some people have a view of intelligence. Her work is about intelligence, by the way. Some people have a view of intelligence as fixed, and some people have a view of intelligence as malleable. Okay? So, what do you think? Can you become more intelligent by working hard? Hands up if you believe that. Okay, who believes the opposite? Who believes that intelligence is pretty much a fixed quantity, fixed by the age of, say, 10, and nothing you can do can have much impact on that? Just raise your hands. My hand is raised. Those of you who raised your hand earlier, you're wrong. The evidence is absolutely clear. I mean, brain damage can change intelligence. If you're talking about fluid intelligence, G, but basically, intelligence is incredibly stable throughout the lifespan. There's a group of Scottish people who were born in the 1930s. They first tested their IQs in 1947, and ever since then, they've kept in touch with them. They've been testing their IQs into their 80s, and basically, it's pretty solid. So but here's the interesting thing. People with growth mindsets do better because they work harder, because they believe that they can become more intelligent. They're wrong about that, but it's a good belief to have. So here's how absurd the research, the mindset stuff is. Do you agree that being tall is good for playing basketball? Do you think that taller people make better basketball players? All other things being equal. Yeah, it's true. If you're a male between the ages of 20 and 40 in North America and 6'3" tall, your odds of being in the NBA are 1 in 200,000. If you're 7 feet tall, the odds are 1 in 6. So being tall is good. Do you think that if you work really hard, you can become taller? No. But if you did believe that and you worked hard, you wouldn't become any taller, but you would become a better basketball player. And that's what so what's actually interesting is that while Carol Dweck's work is in many ways misguided, what schools are doing with it is very smart. Because as long as all you're doing to say to kids is you can be higher achieving than you are right now, you can become more able in mathematics, then good things will happen. But if you use one of Carol Dweck's mindset questionnaires, you'll find you haven't changed a single kid's attitude because the views of intelligence haven't changed. But they still now have higher achievement because they try harder. So the really important thing is what I said earlier about talent. I think it's dishonest of people like Joe Bowler to go around saying ability doesn't matter in mathematics. I mean, I'm not sure if she actually said that in those ways. She's been reported as saying that. Because some people find maths a lot easier than others. And I think it's just insulting to those who find mathematics difficult to say that it's just not true. There are some people who find maths easy. However, there is no limit on what you can achieve in maths if you're willing to work hard at it. So I think we have to put both those things together. Yeah, some people do find it easier, some people find it harder, but there is no limit to what you can achieve if you work hard. I think that's the important point. The EBAC, I don't know. I mean, the EBAC is an extraordinarily clever invention. I don't think anybody realizes how clever the EBAC is. You see, national curriculum used to include modern languages as a compulsory subject in Key Stage 4, right? So all kids had to do it. Even the kids who really couldn't do it at all, who had little interest or aptitude or whatever. So here's what's interesting about the EBAC. There is no incentive for schools to make low achievers do foreign languages because they're never going to get a C, or whatever it is now in the new system. So the EBAC was an extraordinarily clever device for making schools make kids do French if they were any good at it. Do you understand the point I'm making here? So, I mean, I think it was a bad idea, but it's extremely ingenious because Michael Gove didn't say everybody has to do French. The focus was on the higher achieving students because they'll get an EBAC. A low achiever kid who does French and takes the GCSE and gets a very poor grade doesn't actually benefit the school at all. So I don't know, it's just, I don't think that arts and creative areas should be squeezed out. I mean, EBAC is 5 subjects. I think you've got time to do all the others if you think it's important. And what are my views on ragging individual KPI statements or threshold statements? I don't know. I mean, who's doing the ragging? Is it the teacher or the kid? I mean, my problem with all these KPI things, right? I mean, do you have target minimum grades at your school? Why? Sorry, what does it mean? Is it a target or is it a minimum? So let's say of all the kids who are at this level of achievement now, there's going to be a range of the outcomes 5 years later. So take all the kids who got 3 level 4s in key stage 1 testing 5 years ago, whatever. Yeah? There's a range of achievement there. Basically, kids who got 3 level 4s, 5 years later, what do they get? Somewhere between G and A star. Okay? So how do you actually target kids? I mean, sorry, this is a serious question. I have no idea what you do. How do you target? How do you decide a kid's target?
What you expect them to get at the end and their trajectory.
Expected, so that's the average, the mean.
Yeah. Set for us.
Hmm?
Set for us now. They look at what they got in Key Stage 2 and they say they should get this.
Okay, but is it, yeah.
And then we
But
put that.
I know you can take a prediction, but given that there's such a huge spread, for all the kids who got 3 level 4s in old money in Key Stage 2, given that those kids range somewhere from Gs to A stars, where do you pitch the threshold for the kids who got 3 level 4s? If you pitch it at grade C, 40% of those kids are going to pass that with no effort at all. So I just don't understand the whole, I mean, where do you benchmark it?
If they've got 3 level 4s,
Yeah.
your benchmark is from where the level 4 would be at the end.
But the point is that,
6.
but the level 4s are all over the place.
Sorry?
The level 4s are all over the place. The level 4s will be ranging from 1 to 9. Some kids who've got 3 level 4s will end up with a 1, some kids will end with a 9.
They shouldn't.
But they do.
Depends how they've been taught.
I agree.
And it depends, I also think, on a number of other factors.
I agree. But we're not, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking how you go from a statistical model that says, here's what kids who are historically here have ended up. Given that there's a range of those people, do you choose the 50th percentile, the 75th percentile, the 90th percentile? How do you actually pitch the target from the data?
Yeah, from my point of view, the honest answer is that FFT and all the other things that we use,
Yeah.
nothing to do with the kids.
Right.
It's to do with comparing one school to the next, because we're in a system where that's perceived by the government as what we should be doing. Lots of the countries that we're compared against don't do that at all.
Right.
So actually, when FFT come up with, you make a decision as a school that we're going to use whichever column it is from FFT that you're going to use as your, what you're going to set as your aspirational target or your minimum, whichever way you do it as the target, that's actually got nothing to do with the
No,
individual
right,
child.
but you have answered my question therefore, because if you choose FFTD, for example,
Yeah.
then what you're actually saying is, we want every kid achieving at the 75th percentile of expectation.
Yeah.
So basically, that's at least a logically coherent answer. Typically, kids here end up here, on average. We want expectation plus challenge.
Yeah.
So the idea, you've got 25 points of challenge, if you like. But what I'm saying is, the whole enterprise of target setting doesn't tell you how to set the target. Because even if you use FFTD, you're going to have 25% of kids doing better than that, no matter what. So it wasn't a very challenging target for them. So all I'm saying is, the whole business of target setting strikes me as being very fraught, because either you end up with targets that are too easy for a lot of kids, or too hard for a lot of kids.
Or you can have a range. So you could have a target grade range.
Yes, yeah,
And with that range, there is a built-in aspiration.
Right.
And there is an acknowledgement of achievement.
yeah, absolutely. So that was Carol Taylor Fitzgibbon's idea, that basically you'd have this, she called it a chances graph, which I didn't like, because I didn't like the idea of chance being the determinant.
Nijis and Yellis used to do that.
Yeah, so basically, but I quite like the idea of, right, kids who are where you are now ended up between here and here. And if you DOS, you're going to be down here. And if you work really hard, you're going to be up here, and let's see how well you can do. So, I mean, that kind of thing I think is genuinely helpful. But I think the actual targeting beyond that is, I mean, I just don't understand how it helps. Because you end up expecting too little from too many kids. That's the only point I was going to make. Okay, so lastly, no, actually, penultimate, how can you measure progress from formative assessment in a high-achieving school? It's actually no difficult. No different. Well, it'll be easier now with the 1 to 9 grades. But what is interesting is how few kids in grammar schools get A stars in every subject in the old money. So what is interesting is that, I don't know if you know this, but grammar schools' value added is actually quite modest. And the thing they always used to say was, well, we haven't got enough headroom. But if your kids are getting B's and A's rather than A stars, then you've got plenty of headroom. And the fact is, they just weren't very good schools. Some of them were, some of them weren't, like most other schools. So I think you've got plenty of headroom. Whether you can attribute that to formative assessment, I don't know. But the other thing, of course, in high achieving schools is you've got the time. I mean, the thing that people really struggle with when you're under the cosh of special measures is, you have to resort to some fairly kind of dubious things to get out of purgatory, special measures purgatory. So,
I don't think you have got the time in a high achieving school.
Don't you?
If you don't produce that result, then the next year...
Sorry, let me be clear. Everything that teachers do with regard to formative assessment raises kids' exam results. In terms of time, I'm talking about curriculum. So here's the issue with our curriculum. In every country in the world, whenever they have a national curriculum, governments pitch the national curriculum at a level to keep the fastest learning students busy. It looks as if people can't abide the thought that kids might have some free time. So we actually have to keep every kid occupied. So when we actually pitch the national curriculum so as to keep the fastest learning students busy, there ends up being way too much of it for everybody else. The point I was making about grammar schools is that actually in grammar schools, high achieving schools, kids can generally learn fast enough to actually cover most of the curriculum. And that means you have the time to do this. Formative assessment will help you do it better, but you haven't got quite so many difficult choices about which bits to leave out if you want to create slack. Because the important thing about formative assessment is you have to have slack to do formative assessment. If you have no slack in the system, you might as well just not listen to the kids at all. Just teach. Because if there's no chance to go back and do things that the kids haven't learned, there's no point in finding out they haven't learned it. So slack is essential to formative assessment. And it's much harder to find slack when you've got kids who find learning more difficult, when kids go slower. That's all I was trying to say. But maybe there are some schools that are very, very high achieving where this is a problem. But for the vast majority, even of highly selective grammar schools, the ones that take the top 5% of the population, you've still got enough stretch. And of course, when you get into the sixth form, you've got, other things like Oxbridge examinations and things like that. There's no problem with stretching kids. And the other thing is, my experience has been that kids in those schools are often less exam focused as well. I mean, they care about the exams, but they're also interested in other things. Finally, do you believe a lecturing style of education is more effective if the students can concentrate? I just don't know. I don't know. I think we are learning that a lot of the received wisdom about kids can't concentrate for more than 10 minutes or something is just wrong. And I think that a lot of the stuff that we're doing as a reaction to teachers talking at the front of the class is pretty bad, and maybe even worse than the thing for which it's meant to be a cure. But I think we're discovering it's much more complex than that. What I will say, and I'll touch on this briefly in my keynote later on, what we are, I think, discovering is that our whole focus on skills over the last 20 years has been misguided. As E.D. Hirsch says, skill is content and content is skill. John Sweller sums it up like this. Novices have to use thinking skills. Experts use knowledge. The thing that distinguishes novices from experts is mostly the contents of long-term memory. You know, the reasoning, thinking capacity of experts is pretty much the same as novices. It's this thing called short-term working memory, which is highly linked to IQ and can't be increased very much. So I think what we are discovering is that we have to make sure that when we teach kids, we are building up long-term memory. The purpose of school is to develop long-term memory in children for content that we value. There are no skills independent of that long-term memory. And lecturing can be effective and it can be ineffective, like just about everything else.